Welcome back, everybody. So today I thought I would talk about Star Wars a little bit. More specifically, where Star Wars started to go wrong. That shouldn't cause me any kind of trouble, right? I think we can all predict nothing but smooth sailing in terms of comments. So let's go ahead and just rip the Band-Aid right off this thing. So to cut right to the chase, I would say the problem was Return of the Jedi. I mean, you saw the title and thumbnail, so you probably know what's going on here, right? However, this conclusion, like any conclusion about Star Wars, is a little bit complicated. So to get to the bottom of how true I think it is and what exactly I mean by it, I want to talk a minute about this whole phenomena of how we process and try to understand these movies. That itself, along with maybe keeping me out of trouble by hedging a little bit, can actually be more interesting than any one specific conclusion on this topic, so I think it's worth spending a little bit of time to talk about. Now, this whole idea that Star Wars went wrong at some point is nothing new, right? It's pretty much conventional wisdom by this point, the lens through which most people see the series. Basically, Star Wars used to be great and is now much worse. And this decline is often seen to be the result of, or at least marked by, one movie or show, which was probably highly anticipated and turned out to be a disappointment. When this happened is always up for debate, but it seems like there's usually a prevailing discourse that shifts with time. In the early 2000s, it seems like the prequels are the bad guys, and now it's the sequels or maybe streaming shows or whatever. And before all that, there was a maybe less intense thing about Return of the Jedi. But while this discourse is always evolving, there seems to be a fairly consistent trend running through it, which is that people tend to love whatever they saw when they were younger and hate things that came out when they were older, leading to the broad understanding that people see Star Wars through a lens of nostalgia. Now, I don't think it's all nostalgia. I think there is something to this idea of Star Wars going down in quality with time, or at least not being what it once was in some way. But this whole scheme fairly obviously simplifies the situation. Takes a bunch of messy stuff and just puts it into a neat little package for us. So before getting into Jedi, I want to talk about a couple things that kind of complicate it. First is that the body of work that people can most universally agree represents pure, unadulterated, pre-shark-jumping Star Wars is made up of 2 movies. That's really not a lot. We've kind of gotten used to this idea of Star Wars being this boundlessly extensive, sweeping universe with tons of lore behind it. But by the time Return of the Jedi came out, this whole thing was still pretty fresh and new without a lot of material or story building established yet. I mean, yeah, along with the movies, there were some books, but even they were pretty sparse by that point and didn't contribute much to what Star Wars was, at least in the broader public perception. What's more, and I know a lot of people are going to argue with me about this, but hear me out, a lot of what we understand about Star Wars came solely from The Empire Strikes Back. Like, take the concept of the Force, for instance. Sure, it definitely was described and used in the first movie, but a ton of the philosophy and emotional feel of it was established in Empire. Not to mention the character of Yoda himself. Or Darth Vader. When you picture Darth Vader, you're probably picturing Empire Strikes Back Darth Vader. He was more of a generic thug in the first one, and he acted and talked a bit different than what we're used to. Even the Millennium Falcon, its broken down personality and the way we picture it flying, like swooping around and dodging asteroids and stuff, was totally absent until Empire Strikes Back. And there's a lot more beyond that, including daily operations of the Empire and the Rebellion, use of Star Destroyers, main characters like Han, Leia, and Chewie, to which this is true in a more abstract or maybe lesser degree. Now, a lot of what I'm saying is pretty obvious, right? Like, stories get fleshed out as they go. And some of this might be arguable. That's totally fine. I know I might be right about some of this, wrong about other parts of it. A lot of this comes down to semantics and personal perception, so I don't really want to get lost in the weeds over making specific conclusions about this. But if you just close your eyes and try to picture these characters and concepts purely in terms of the first movie, I think you'll get some sense of what I'm talking about. Basically, in 1983, what we now consider long-established foundational elements of Star Wars came from 2 movies, and a disproportionate amount was from one previous movie. Keeping that in mind can help us maintain a sense of perspective on how fresh and fragile the Star Wars mythos was at that time, as well as what we see happening when we watch Return of the Jedi. It can also help us manage our expectations for what is actually being ruined when one movie does things a little differently than 2 other movies. Second, and I know this is one of those areas this can get really touchy, we need to acknowledge how much nostalgia can cause us to romanticize movies we saw when we were younger and be excessively disappointed by ones we saw when we were older. In other words, Star Wars may never have been quite as good as we think it was. Now, I don't mean that it was never good or even great. The first one, don't ask me to call it A New Hope, by the way, I'm 50 years old and its name is Star Wars, is a super exciting movie that revolutionized science fantasy action. Did a great job setting up world building, characterization, and story elements in a natural way that maintained good pacing. It also captures an original on-screen mythology in a way that I'm not sure has been duplicated before or since, even if people overblow the profundity of its junior hire's first guide to the hero's journey structure. Of course, yes, it's a little rough around the edges and a lot of its cinematography is basic, but it still deserves credit for being more than just a simple action movie. Empire Strikes Back, of course, the high point of the series. It improved on the Star Wars formula in about every conceivable way possible, and is probably the perfect science fantasy action movie. I think we all know that. None of you need me to tell you that Empire Strikes Back is good and why, right? But as good as these movies are, they definitely are flawed. Star Wars more than Empire, of course, but they definitely have some, cornball elements to them. Whereas the prequels had their Jar Jar and Return of the Jedi had its Ewoks, though that's getting ahead of ourselves. The first two had their Jawas, their silly droid humor, and their little pig guys who played keep away with C-3PO's head. Whereas the prequels had I Don't Like Sand, the first movies had I Care, Look Sir Droids, Good Our First Catch of the Day, and so on. Of course, there are also the various implausibilities and plot holes that we've just kind of gotten used to making excuses for, but that, I'm sorry, are still very much there. Now, I'm not saying that these elements of the first two movies are terrible. I'm not trying to both sides of the first movies and the later ones or anything like that and just say, oh, they'll have their thing. I personally think that the first two movies at least are qualitatively different than a lot of the later ones, in that these elements are less distracting and oftentimes work to give the movies this corny charm and add to their appeal as homage to adventure serials and stuff. But of course, the trick is recognizing when they're actually not that bad, and when you're just viewing them through the lens of nostalgia and making excuses for them that are so familiar you don't even know you're making them. I don't even think you can figure out exactly where that line is, nor do I care to try. Would just get me nothing but trouble anyway. My point is just that wherever that line is, Star Wars was flirting with it from the beginning. Its very nature as a sometimes lighthearted throwback to these old adventure serials put it just right on this tenuous razor's edge, where all it took was a little bit too much silliness here, the action getting a little bit too implausible there, and suddenly it jumped the shark from good homage to bad garbage. Sorry about that. And I'm not claiming this framework is totally accurate, or at least not all-encompassing, doesn't explain everything about Star Wars. I know that some of the differences between the older movies and newer ones are sometimes pretty drastic and have nothing to do with this. But I think recognizing this can help us see that in some ways, Star Wars can appear to crash and burn without falling from this place of totally unassailable quality to just absolute trash. Some of what's corny about Return of the Jedi, or the prequels or whatever else, is just stuff that's corny about Star Wars in general. It's kind of inherent to its nature. Other parts are worse. So trying to distinguish between these two things can help keep our criticisms fair and help you parse out to some degree when a certain property, Return of the Jedi or whatever else, is actually running off the rails and when it's just being Star Wars. I know this can be a very difficult thing to do. A lot of it's pretty subjective. A lot of it probably does have to do with, what era you grew up watching. And any conversation about a property as lighthearted as Star Wars is going to be a little bit especially subjective. Where exactly you draw that line between fun lighthearted and too lighthearted. So I'm just kind of laying out my personal opinion, not trying to get down to final answers here. Not trying to tell you exactly what you should think about Star Wars, but hopefully you still find it informative and interesting. If not in my final conclusions, at least just how I talk about this whole phenomenon in general. Now, part of this will just be talking about the quality of Return of the Jedi in isolation. How is it bad as its own movie? But more than that, I want to talk about how it introduced trends that fundamentally degraded the mentality of the series and set precedents that led to a lot of the problems we're seeing with movies today. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that Return of the Jedi is Star Wars at its worst, not even close. Just that it seemed to signal a pretty clear downward turn. Also, that a lot of the things that bother you about maybe the prequels or the sequel trilogy, if you don't like those things, a lot of that stuff was starting to happen in Return of the Jedi, and maybe Return of the Jedi is responsible for a lot of it. Now, if we're talking about Return of the Jedi not being great, the obvious first thing that will come to everybody's mind is the Emperor. Just kidding, it's Ewoks. Nobody liked the Ewoks. I mean, no big surprise there, right? In fact, this is very clearly my first recollection of Star Wars hatred. Back in the 90s when I was first getting on the internet, you could barely touch a Usenet Star Wars forum without just being slapped in the face by how much everybody hated them. In fact, there was this informal organization called FART, Fans Against Highly Regrettable Slur for a Disabled Person, Teddy Bears. Basically, they were what ruined Star Wars before the prequels ruined Star Wars, at least in the public perception. So did they actually ruin Star Wars for real, though? Well, that's kind of an obviously dramatic thing to say, and maybe I'll get into that more later. But also, silly, cute, dramatic characters are just really easy to scapegoat when a movie's not meeting your expectations. Like maybe they are a problem, but sometimes they're just easy to fall to, and I think this is because they're easy to recognize. Like let's just say, for example, that you found it hard to stay interested in the prequel trilogy because of the constant abrupt switches between hyperactive CGI action scenes and dry dialogue delivered on claustrophobic green screen sets, or because the main battles were hard to care about because they were just jokes on the main characters and thus didn't matter. These kinds of things would probably affect your enjoyment of the movie from start to finish on a really fundamental level. But the problem is they're nuanced and complicated enough that you're not necessarily going to pick them up right away. It might take you a little bit of thought and reflection to understand that that's not what you liked about the movie, maybe after a couple of viewings. To paraphrase a wise scholar, you might not have noticed that they made you bored even if your brain did. By contrast, you immediately notice if you're repeatedly exposed to a silly cartoon character who talks like a moron. But how much does this character's existence by itself actually undermine the core quality of the movie? To put this into perspective, imagine that The Phantom Menace was in all other ways on par with, say, The Empire Strikes Back, except that it had more Jar Jar in it. Or if it makes it easier, you can imagine Jar Jar just literally appeared in Empire. Would that have made it a bad movie? Maybe. I'm not trying to discount that possibility. Like maybe the clash between that character and the rest of the movie might have been a big distraction. Hell, maybe the fact that that movie was otherwise better could have made Jar Jar's appearance that much more jarring. Who knows whether you would have liked the movie a lot more or just resented the character more for ruining it. Now, I don't expect this thought experiment to get us down to any one specific conclusion, especially about any specific movie or any specific character. The point is more just to get us to see the disconnect between what we find more obviously annoying in a movie and what actually most ruins it for us. Silly characters can warrant real complaints, I'm not trying to deny that. But I think setting them aside and digging more into the bones of possibly deeper problems with a movie is just worth doing. And it'll probably give you a better sense of why you actually didn't like a movie. Don't like the character, hate it all you want, but I think just maybe temporarily setting it aside will help a little bit. That's all to say we shouldn't get too distracted by Ewoks when talking about Return of the Jedi. There are a lot more fundamental things that went wrong with the movie, and definitely deeper issues that set up problems with the franchise moving forward. And we'll get into that more later. But first, are the Ewoks that bad? Short answer, yes. I wanted to give a sense of perspective before putting blame on them, but they are definitely worse than, just another set of cute or funny characters. They're a lot worse than that, and I see two main reasons why. One is just the simple incongruity between them and the general world building of Star Wars. And to see what I mean, let's make the natural comparison to Jawas. On one hand, the Jawas are child-sized, squeaky characters who are played at least somewhat silly at times. At the very least, they represent some kind of interruption to a very serious space opera tone. And people who want that tone for Star Wars probably would have hated on Jawas if the original trilogy was all we had and the Ewoks didn't exist. At the very least, somebody knows what you're referring to if you make a comparison between Ewoks and Jawas, right? But on the other hand, the Jawas are at least plausible. Like there are some things about them that are coded as maybe childish, but you could see scavengers like that existing on Tatooine and functioning the way they do. Their aesthetic at least somewhat fits the tone of the Star Wars universe, and most of what's silly about them comes from stuff like the little Utini scream, their back and forth with the droids, and the way they annoy local farmers like Luke and Owen. By contrast, the Ewoks are a completely telegraphed artificial injection of cuteness into the story. I mean, they're pretty much literally teddy bears. Regardless of any stories about George Lucas's dog or how he started with Wookiees and ended up with them, the end result looks like he eventually just told his costume designers to make big unstuffed teddy bears for people to climb into. I mean, maybe none of this is true, Maybe they had no intention whatsoever of making them look like teddy bears and didn't even see the connection. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is they do look like teddy bears to audiences. And that creates this drastic fourth wall breaking effect of seeing cute plush toys just thrown into a Star Wars movie. They don't look like anything that would plausibly populate or survive on a science fiction planet. The end result of this is that the moment Leia crashes her speeder and Wicket appears, we pause for this short little kids movie. Like seriously, it almost seems like an integrated ad for a kid's spin-off. And because the Ewoks and this whole episode are written so artificially, the main characters come off as totally artificial in dealing with them. Like, okay, Luke just got finished with an episode of Sesame Street, now time for him to go be tempted by the dark side. It's baffling, and the effect is way more than just some cute characters in the story. The other part of it is more obvious, which is that, they successfully fought against stormtroopers. That's a line you just can't cross with silly characters in a drama or action movie. If you want to include them, they need to be at least somewhat isolated from the majority of the story and just appear for the thing they're there for. Otherwise, the whole story starts to feel silly, especially if these characters are part of the dramatic resolution. Like, how do you take the movie at all seriously at this point? Like, I get that stormtroopers have never really come off well, but you've really crossed a line when you have them being tackled by teddy bears and, that's how the good guys win. Sorry, that just doesn't work. It's seriously stupid. Now, that's more than I thought I'd ever say about Ewoks. I thought they were pretty much a straightforward topic that I'd rush through. So let's move on to talk about other things about Return of the Jedi that just made it awful. We'll start with one more really well-known gripe people have, which is the plan to rescue Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. Now, this is an incredibly obvious complaint that a lot of other people have already beaten to death, so I won't spend too much time on it. I'll just kind of blow through the general idea and then give my thoughts. Essentially, the whole plan just doesn't make any sense. The steps, as far as I can tell, were 1. Lando infiltrated Jabba's palace. That part happened before Return of the Jedi. 2. The droids came and offered themselves as gifts. 3. Leia showed up as a bounty hunter turning in Chewbacca. And 4. Luke arrived and demanded Han's release. Now, this obviously exposed a lot of characters to needless risk without serving any apparent plan. Like, Luke had no way of knowing that he was going to fall into the Rancor pit and then everybody would be gathered and sent to be fed to the Sarlacc. And this only led to everybody being in convenient places due to pure chance. There literally was no plan behind it. A famously egregious example is sticking Luke's lightsaber in R2-D2. This made no sense unless they were counting on him being positioned to launch it at Luke through the open air right as he needed it. Also, does Jabba's palace not scan droids for weapons? Okay, go watch other people, I guess, if you're not familiar with this. The description has a link to Cosmonaut Variety Hour, who I think summed it up pretty well. But what I find especially strange is that this whole setup included 2 plots, each of which seemed designed to work on its own. First was when Leia snuck in with the apparent goal of thawing Han and sneaking him out in the middle of the night. And second was when Luke strode in all Jedi-like and demanded that Jabba release Han while using his Jedi mind powers on him. Now, both of these things went wrong, but it seems like it was expected or at least hoped that they would have worked. Which means that each one of these plans should have been the beginning and end of the whole thing. So it's not just the matter of Luke's plan being convoluted. It's that he had 2 separate plans that were pretty straightforward in and of themselves and just kind of threw in all these extra sacrificial lambs for no reason that I can tell. Like, yeah, I do see the point of redundancy in case a plan goes wrong, but what I don't see is the point of sending droids in there as gifts or putting Chewbacca in there to be sent down into a prison. I don't think that really helped anything. I mean, sure, Luke wanted to warn Jabba possibly. Leia used Chewbacca to get in there. But it seems like there were ways to do those things without, setting people up to be trapped and so now you have more people to rescue. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, I could also see asking why the rebellion didn't just storm in there and rescue them by force, right? Like as Leia said, we have powerful friends, you're going to regret this. So she kind of alluded to that. But this is more of a nitpicky realism question, something that could be asked of all Star Wars. So I think this is a good illustration of something that's, maybe a tiny bit unrealistic, but doesn't stick out as glaringly as Luke's plan. So, this one's just of interest to show the difference between what was uniquely bad in A Return of the Jedi way and just what's the nature of Star Wars, maybe. But beyond just being bad in and of itself, this whole rescue operation plot served 2 purposes, each of which kind of cuts to the heart of what's wrong with Return of the Jedi and how it set up things that went wrong with Star Wars later. One is the hurry to cover a lot of narrative ground. Too much narrative ground, most people would probably say. Me potentially being one of them. It was pretty conspicuously tacked onto the beginning of a movie that was otherwise about an attack on the Death Star and Luke being tempted by the dark side. It's pretty obvious and one of the biggest complaints about the movie other than the Ewoks. So why is it this way? A story decision this strange seems to warrant some kind of explanation, right? One well-known theory is that Lucas was kind of backed into a corner due to Harrison Ford wanting out of Star Wars. Nobody was sure whether Ford would come back for a third movie, so freezing Han in carbonite was Lucas's way of kind of tentatively writing Han out of the story while leaving the door open for him to possibly come back. Kinda makes sense. But the problem is, when you think about it, it kind of put Lucas in a bit of a lose-lose situation. If Ford does not come back, then, well, no Han Solo. Obvious, right? But then if he does come back, Lucas still has to somehow get him unfrozen and out of Jabba's hands before integrating him back into the story. And as far as I can tell, the most straightforward reading of this tacked-on half-hour adventure episode is that it was Lucas's way of doing just that. Problem is, it's just about the dumbest possible way of handling this situation. Like, think of all the alternatives considering how Return of the Jedi went and how this threw off its pacing. For one, Lucas could have, let Han die. Sorry, Harrison Ford. F*** around and find out, I guess. Or he could have made the rescue operation a side plot that ran for most of the movie. This would give us a smaller, more personal story to run parallel to the bigger operation against the Empire. And there's really no rush to get Han back into the main action, because he famously spent most of the movie just doing busy work on Endor anyway. So this actually kills two birds with one stone by tying up the loose end and giving Han, Lando, and maybe Leia a meaningful storyline actually related to their characters. Or, here's a thought, Lucas could have just said in the title crawl that they rescued him between movies and leave it at that. Seems cheap, but if you're in this kind of pickle, it seems like fixing it with a stroke of a pen is better than complicating your whole movie and throwing off your pacing and everything, right? Besides, they do this kind of thing for other storylines all the time, sometimes major ones. Now there's this other theory kind of related to the first, which is that Han's rescue was going to be its own movie, possibly in a long-running series that was going to continue almost indefinitely. And while it seems this isn't true, pointing out this hypothetical possibility brings up an important point, which is that Star Wars as presented to us at the end of Empire Strikes Back basically demanded that kind of series. Han's capture felt like something that warranted significant resolution, something along the lines of an entire movie or at least lengthy storyline. And it wasn't the only storyline left needing this kind of attention. Seriously, think of where we were at the end of Empire. The rebellion was reeling after having been driven from yet a second base, leaving us with a question of how they're going to recover, much less make any kind of headway against the Empire. Luke had interrupted his Jedi training, so that still needed to be completed, and in fact he had just finished showing us that he was worse than useless as a Jedi. Yoda and Obi-Wan had written him off as a lost cause and mentioned some mysterious other hope they had, leaving us to wonder who that was and whether they'd step up and replace the battered Luke in some way. Vader claimed to be Luke's father, leaving us to wonder not only whether that's true but whether Obi-Wan was lying to Luke. And of course Han Solo had been frozen in carbonite and shipped off to Jabba the Hutt, setting up the biggest immediate cliffhanger at the end. Even the Luke, Leia, Han love triangle was left hanging in a pretty emotionally powerful way given questions about Han's fate. It's kind of easy to forget a lot of this in hindsight, to lose the impact of Empire's ending, to forget just how many unanswered questions there were and how uncertain the fate of the characters seemed. We're too used to resolutions we've known about for years and to seeing these characters as permanent fixtures of the franchise. But it had to have been unsettling for the people who originally watched it. I mean, just a brilliant ending. Which is great for the quality of Empire itself, but it puts a big burden on the rest of the movies to pay off everything that had been set up. And when you think about everything on this list, it would take an ongoing saga of at least 3 additional movies to wrap this all up in any kind of satisfying way. I mean, it's not like I have any math or storyline sketch behind that, but it seems right, and you probably get my point in broad terms anyway. So if Lucas intended to wrap this up in one movie, if he'd envisioned this as a contained trilogy from the start, which from everything I'd heard he had, then he'd badly lost control of his storylines by the end of Empire. There was just too much left to do, leaving him with the options of making more movies than he'd originally intended, or using his third one as a checklist of plot points to just be run through as quickly as possible. Han Solo was captured? Okay, then I guess let's plunk a half-hour plus episode about him getting rescued at the start of the movie. And we all know they did that one, but when you think about it, Jedi is just full of storylines being treated even more dismissively than that. The rebellion's on its heels because the Empire, struck back? Well, don't show it actually clawing its way back over the course of several movies. Just put the Emperor on a new Death Star that they can blow up so we can just assume the Empire was instantly ended by decapitating its leadership. Luke didn't finish his training? Just have Yoda say, yeah, you actually don't need it, in direct contradiction to what he'd very strongly insisted in the previous movie. Vader's claim to be his father and the possibility of Obi-Wan being a liar? Just have Yoda say yep and Obi-Wan say stupid nonsense about a certain point of view and pretend that means he wasn't, being a liar. That other hope? Just have it be Luke's sister and reveal that she's Leia. Which also closes any possible loops on the love triangle, even if one sloppy kiss too late. And all of this also instantly setting aside questions about Luke's status in the story and nullifying the intriguing possibility of some mysterious replacement Jedi running around out there somewhere. And notice how much of this was settled in Luke's 5-minute trip to Dagobah. Lucas literally had Luke take a quick pit stop there so Yoda could just rapid-fire tie up loose ends and then die. It's one of the dumbest things I've ever seen a movie do, not to mention an egregious use of one of the most impactful mentor characters in the history of cinema. And it's just emblematic of Return of the Jedi as a movie. Part of what made The Empire Strikes Back so great was that it introduced all this lore and all these questions that begged to be fleshed out in rich ways over the course of a long saga. Even if it wasn't promising such a series, it made it feel like that's what Star Wars was. So it was just such a drastic reversal to have Return of the Jedi come along and flush it all down the toilet. It didn't just rob us of story potential. It changed the fundamental nature of what Star Wars was and what we expected of it. Instead of this sweeping story that we could dwell in as it unfolded in meaningful, methodical ways, which is what Empire felt like the start of, it just kind of rapid-fire threw Star Wars stuff at us, which obviously set a precedent for what the series was moving forward. Now, it's hard to say how much of this is the fault of Return of the Jedi. Maybe it caused this trend partly by trying to do too much too quickly, or maybe Star Wars was always bound to become too self-aware and thus self-referential, and Jedi just happened to be where the unraveling started. Either way, it sucks. But hey, at least it made the movie itself unbearably rushed and unfocused. Anyway, speaking of just throwing Star Wars stuff at the audience instead of progressing the plot, the other thing the Han Solo rescue showed is the movie's tendency to just shove popular characters and other elements into the movie just because we know who they are. That's really what's behind Luke's plan. It's not really about Luke trying to find the best way to rescue Han. It's about Lucas trying to find a way to get all the characters into Jabba's palace so we can see them there. Thank you, I'll be here all day. Compare this to the first two movies where the characters were more or less where you'd expect them to be for the sake of the story. I mean, this wasn't even an issue for the first one because, they were all brand new. But even in Empire, it feels like plot came first and characters were inserted where they were needed. After the rebellion was scattered at Hoth, Luke went to continue his Jedi training, makes sense, and Han and Leia were trying to escape the Empire in the broken-down Falcon. I mean, sure, the story was obviously engineered to keep Han in the rebellion and put them together for the escape. Movies do this kind of thing by necessity. But it felt natural, and any contrivances were meant to serve specific story arcs more than just put familiar faces on screen. I mean, they even split up the classic pair R2-D2 and C-3PO. Compare this to Return of the Jedi, where the movie starts by ushering all the characters into Jabba's palace for no reason other than that they can be there. They even throw in a line to telegraph what's happening. It's the one where Han says "together again" and Luke says "wouldn't miss it." I always hated this line, even since I was a kid. Seriously, from the time I was about 10 years old, I could pick up that the movie here was kind of winking at us about the fact that it was gathering all its characters like, its favorite action figures to play with while we watched. Hey Luke, hey Han, we have the team together, now time for another adventure. I don't know, maybe some people will take exception to this, like, yeah, maybe it's fun to have the characters kind of playfully say hi when they meet back up. But to me, in this specific situation, that just sounded like a really unnatural thing to say, and it was just kind of distracting in a fourth wall breaking way. And this wasn't a one-time thing. This practice continues throughout the movie to the point of dictating almost everything about where every character was going to be and what they were going to be doing. In fact, they jump right back into this the moment the rebellion regroups. The first thing we learn is that they're putting a main character in charge of each prong of its attack. For no good reason, we'll definitely get back to that. And as soon as it's announced Han's leading the land strike, here we go, we have all the other main characters step up and ceremonially announce that they're going along. Rawr! General, count me in! And then the voice of Luke calls out, I'm with you too! Like what this movie needed was another meta announcement that they're getting the crew back together, so let's throw that in. And by the way, what kind of organization is the rebellion running here? Do they decide who's going to be part of their most delicate, important operations by letting people just shout that they're joining? Right there in the assembly in front of all the troops? So great, now you have a squad full of friends whose judgment might be compromised by the personal and romantic investments they have in each other. Oh yeah, and let's include droids. One who can only roll and one who's the most visible thing you can possibly bring along with you. Now, I know there's a point here where I could start nitpicking normal Star Wars-like action movie stuff, but I feel like they're going way over the top to get the crew back together, and especially to signal to us that that's what they're doing. That's what makes this feel different, and kind of worse. Like I mentioned before, it's getting way too self-referential, which drastically changes the nature of the experience watching Star Wars, and not in a good way. Okay, so now let's circle back to Han and Lando being generals. What the f***? First off, do generals fly fighter craft and go on ground assault missions? I may be no militariologist, but it sure doesn't seem like it. But I guess more to the point, why do they assign these guys? It's pretty absurd. Han was a smuggler who was openly uninterested in the rebellion as a cause, and who was last seen saying he wanted to leave while repeatedly sexually harassing one of its leaders. Then he just suddenly shows up after having been kept frozen in carbonite by a gang leader he'd had dealings with, and you make him a general? No questions about his loyalty? About how traumatized he might still be? No? Lando, of course, is even more obviously absurd. The rebellion didn't know him from Adam except for the fact that he was a shady businessman who had, oh yeah, betrayed members of the rebellion and openly collaborated with Darth Vader. That's not the kind of thing you can paint over with a throwaway line about a maneuver at the Battle of Tanab, or the fact that we as an audience feel vindicated by the fact that he helped rescue Han. I wouldn't tell this guy where the fleet was, much make him a general. Now again, I should reinforce the fact that this is not about nitpicking people's military qualifications. I mean, this is a Star Wars movie after all. It's about how clumsily they're being shoehorned into the story. These characters being assigned these positions is a non sequitur that, as clearly as Luke throwing everybody into Jabba's palace, makes it distractingly obvious that Lucas is just putting familiar characters on screen just because they're familiar characters. The end result is that our heroes spend the movie doing generic tasks that don't feel motivated by or connected to who they are as characters. This makes the movie feel kind of hollow, like we're not really watching these characters. We're watching the actors who play these characters be standard rebellion soldiers. And yeah, I know a couple things about this. First, they're in the rebellion, so they're going to have to fight for the rebellion. That makes sense. But they could still do it in ways that feel like their characters and feel like the motivations of their characters and the roles they would play without just being so generic, I guess. And also, with Han and Lando specifically, I could see people saying that this fits some kind of redemption arc. You know, that they quit being scoundrels and stepped up to join the cause. And yeah, a natural arc showing them gradually evolving into these roles based on motivations natural to their characters would have been great. But that's not what this was. It was just suddenly plopping these characters into whatever role was there. And this is done everywhere you look throughout this movie, or most everywhere for people who want to be nitpicky. Like, why was Boba Fett at Jabba's palace? Now, I know that this one specifically is a super common complaint with an equally common retort. Like, I think people say that he hung around Jabba's palace to be a bodyguard or just worked for him or something like that. But everything about his role in Empire indicated he was a freelancing bounty hunter whose skill set and motivation should have had him out hunting bounties. If you look this appearance dead in the eye for what it is obvious that he is there for fan service. He appeared to be seen real quick and then flushed away like used toilet paper, kind of like they did with Yoda. Even more silly, why was the Millennium Falcon being used to lead the attack on the Death Star? Okay, fine, it's the fastest ship in the fleet. You covered your bases with a throwaway line again. But even assuming that's true in any meaningful way, it's a freighter, not a dedicated fighter craft. And it's an especially bad choice to navigate tight corridors in the middle of the Death Star. It's obviously just being put into the plot because it's familiar. As with Han, Leia, and Lando, Lucas wrote a story that had nothing to do with it and then shoved it into a random role so it could be there. This is why, for me anyway, Return of the Jedi does not feel like a plausible continuation of an actual story. It just felt like globs of Star Wars content being thrown at the screen by the handful. Basically the beginning of extended fan service at the expense of making any kind of real movie. My final point relates to this same Star Wars as content thing, which I think is the core problem with Return of the Jedi. But before getting into that, I first want to just run through a few random bad things about the movie, just for fun and to cover my bases. But first, I'll mention things I liked, just to be nice. I really enjoyed that we saw more of what the actual Rebel fleet looked like. It made sense that they would have big warships, and so that was cool. So were the Mon Calamari, and especially Admiral Akbar.
It's a trap!
I don't know, that part actually works when it's not a meme. Speaking of that, the moment they approached the Death Star and suddenly realized everything was going wrong was way cool. It was one of the few scenes in this movie that felt like a plausible military operation, and it was super dramatic, including the music. Okay, that'll be all of that. I like the part where they first deployed on Endor and ran into speeder bikes, kind of for the same reason. Again, felt like a real science fiction military thing. It made sense that the Empire would have those for recon or whatever, and the strike team's first encounters with them just felt like it made sense. Of course, a lot of the scenes with Luke and Vader and the Emperor were dramatic and emotionally evocative. It's one of the most popular parts of the movie, and I think people already know that, so I won't dwell on it. There was a lot of real potential there. Finally, and this might sound like a backhanded compliment, but trust me it's not, when I recently rewatched this, I noticed how much of it felt like a product of its time. It had a very pronounced middle of the 80s feel, kind of like E.T., Willow, or The Never-Ending Story. This is a very abstract impression, so it might just be me, but something about the feel of it took me right back to that time, and there was something comforting about it. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you felt the same way. Okay, so now to those miscellaneous bad things. The bad guys in this movie keep doing evil laughs, which is distracting and just unnecessary. Grand Moff Tarkin did a great job hamming it up without going full-on cornball, so it seems like Lucas should know how to walk that line. This makes it seem like one more example of Lucas winking at his audience because he lost confidence in his material. Han Solo both shot the Sarlacc tentacle and accidentally killed Boba Fett while blind. That goes beyond lighthearted action and is just the movie being stupid on purpose. Hated it. As soon as Leia finishes unfreezing Han, Jabba starts laughing and a curtain opens revealing him and all his people there. And remember, this is in the middle of the night. So did they know Leia was in disguise and was going to rescue him that night? Did they stay up all night posed there in the throne room because they thought it would just be that fun to spring a little surprise on them? And did Jabba think, oh man, this will be so funny, I don't care if she unfreezes Han and my favorite decoration is ruined? The whole thing is beyond nonsense. Why is there an interior button in the Rancor pit? I know other people have already brought this up, but that's because it's stupid enough to be worth bringing up. Chewbacca made a Tarzan sound while swinging onto the AT-ST walker. I mean, come on, what needs to be said about that? Luke is annoyingly arrogant, especially in the beginning. He struts around everywhere he goes with this bratty I'm a Jedi now attitude and is always blurting out quips like, that's the last mistake you'll ever make. I don't know if this is supposed to make him come off as an action hero badass, but it sure doesn't land that way. Also, his haircut? They had professional hairdressers, right? It seems like the main characters in this movie never communicate about anything. Like Luke sends the droids to Jabba's palace without telling them he's offering them up to be slaves to the Mafia, and Han doesn't tell anybody he's leading the ground assault on Endor. They just find these things out in public. I know excuses can always be made for these things, but you can just feel intelligent conversation being sacrificed for dramatic reveal moments, and it's just distracting. Han and Leia have no romantic chemistry in this movie. Like, none at all. I mean, I know Star Wars has never been famous for its dialogue, but seriously, what happened to them since The Empire Strikes Back? I mean, yeah, sure, you can blame Han coming out of carbonite or whatever, but it feels a lot more like just bad writing and phoned-in acting. If you're looking for it, you can see how it foreshadows the dialogue between Anakin and Padme in the prequels. Finally, Luke's temptation made no sense. This is something that always bothered me, even since I was a kid. At first, it was hard to tell what the temptation was or even if he was tempting him. The Emperor was just like, ha, your friends are done for, doesn't that make you mad? So does he have a goal or is he just kind of being an asshole? Of course, eventually, and in a meandering way, this eventually shapes up into a temptation to kill the Emperor, but that in and of itself is nonsensical. Killing the Emperor would just be an objectively good thing to do, even if Luke was feeling anger when he did it. I mean, right? Like, has nobody ever done good while feeling righteous anger? And even if what Luke did was more than that, if he was killing because his emotions got the better of him, would that instantly make him evil? Maybe he could just think, ooh, I got out of control there and I need to reel it back and think a little bit? It seems to me that falling to the dark side would involve more of a gradual descent where a series of attitudes and actions over time change you into a different person. Not a thing where the nature of who you are changes because of one action. I mean, you can just say that's how the Force works, but then that would just make the mechanics of the whole thing frivolous and not reflective of or insightful into human nature. And even if the decision to kill the Emperor did suddenly flip a switch and make Luke a bad person, shouldn't that have happened the moment he took a swing at him? He had every intention of killing him, right? So how does Vader physically restraining him from doing what he fully intended to do change the kind of person he is? Like, oh, I was going to be evil, but somebody blocked me from it. And if Luke had to succeed in killing the Emperor for it to work, then what does the Emperor gain since he's dead? I mean, the whole thing's just incoherent. Now, I guess you could claim the Emperor is playing some kind of 4D chess where nothing he says is true and he's just provoking the two into fighting or something. But what he says seems expressed by the movie in earnest, and should be since it's providing the dramatic thrust for the scene. If it's not, then the whole scene is still so muddy and convoluted that it loses the audience anyway, which is the initial problem. There's a lot of emotionally evocative stuff here, but when it's not grounded in anything that makes sense, who cares? And it can't just make sense after the fact to over-enthusiastic Star Wars apologists. It has to provide some kind of evident thrust for the people watching. Oh, and also, by the way, if you could pull this off, then you could just claim that anybody who kills you turns to the dark side, and then don't kill me, ha ha ha. So anyway, back to the main narrative, my final point is about how much Return of the Jedi just keeps retreading familiar ground. This really ties together a lot of what I've been talking about so far. If there's one central problem with Return of the Jedi other than, its own quality, one thing that affected the franchise going forward, it's that it represents Star Wars getting too familiar with itself. The fact that it's so busy trying to tie up old plot points makes it feel too obsessed with the previous two movies to progress the story in its own unique ways. So does, obviously, its flagrant fan-servicey way of marching familiar characters in front of us. Even the Ewok thing. Ewoks aren't really a throwback as such, but they're still a derivation of Wookiees with maybe some Jawa flavor added. Hell, the name Ewok is basically just Wookiee backward. But beyond that, maybe even deeper than that, the fact that Ewoks are so obviously teddy bears takes away from Star Wars' long time ago in a galaxy far, far away vibe by referring to something so obviously from our world. I know this point more than most is pretty vibe-based and a matter of personal perception and semantics and stuff like that, but it's pretty obvious at this point that Star Wars has descended into meta-communication with its audience. And part of this is Return of the Jedi just repeating familiar plot beats from the first two movies. Now, I'm not saying that's all this movie does. Of course, there are some exceptions. The rescue of Han and the temptation of Luke are both original and continue ongoing storylines, even if the rescue one was... well, we've covered that. But even then, the Han Solo one has us going back to Tatooine, which feels like revisiting a familiar place just to revisit a familiar place. The planet was a total backwater in the original movie. The kind of middle-of-nowhere hillbilly place you wouldn't expect a story to take us back to once the main character who happened to live there left. Now, I know there was a function for going there, but Lucas still wrote that functionality into the story. And even if it wasn't intended as a throwback to the previous two movies, it still reads as one. So no matter what Lucas's reasons, no matter when he'd originally decided that Jabba was actually headquartered on Tatooine, I maintain the story would have been better if Tatooine was just a backwater place where Luke happened to live and Han happened to be accosted by a bounty hunter when they met, and then the story, never really felt a need to go back there. That would have given the universe a feeling of being a big place full of random people meeting each other at random places, not a place of crisscrossing references to familiar places and characters who all know each other. That all said, I do suspect that on some level Lucas was milking nostalgia even if I can't prove it. But the really big obvious one, of course, is the Death Star. We all know it's a repeat from the first movie, of course, but I'm not sure everybody gets just how totally damning its inclusion in Jedi is. The first Death Star worked great as a specific thing the Empire built for a specific military and political purpose, and you can see it as the kind of impractical money pit an unimaginative totalitarian regime might build once to intimidate its population. No, I'm not going to try to claim there was no logical reason to build another one. I mean, Return of the Jedi explicitly gives us one. It's a trap! I'm just suggesting the story would have been better without one. There was something rich about how The Empire Strikes Back showed the Empire striking back with naval chases and other practical military operations. Going from there into Jedi, there was so much potential for unique storylines that would have been interesting and just made the world feel more real. By contrast, going back to another Death Star just felt like lazy comfort food for the audience. And they pulled one more repeat act that was even more detrimental to the series, even if it doesn't stick out as much, which is the Leia is Luke's sister thing. This was horrible. Just absolutely horrible. Vader being Luke's father was an incredibly dramatic twist, even if it awkwardly retconned the he betrayed and murdered your father thing and forced us to watch Obi-Wan act like a childish weasel about the semantics of the fact that he got caught in a giant lie. But this kind of twist is best as a one-time thing. Pull it on the audience once, and they're like, holy cow, these two are related! Pull it on them twice, and they're like, okay, now we're doing this again. Now, maybe this kind of thing can work as a 1-2 punch if done super carefully, but most of the time, as in this case I would suggest, it just comes off as lazy retread. Along with giving your audience surprise burnout, it just makes your universe feel small. The odds in an actual galaxy of randomly running into someone you knew or connected to would just be astronomically tiny, like almost would never happen, right? So the more you show your characters meeting random people in random places, the more you make your world feel expansive and exciting and real. The more you show apparently random people being related to each other by blood or whatever other connection, the more you give your audience the at least instinctive feeling that the events of your movie operate in a constricted space full of people who are all part of a small in-group. And the worst part of all this is that it sets a precedent for the rest of the series. We've seen multiple versions of another Death Star, including the Mothership in Phantom Menace and the Starkiller base in The Force Awakens. And of course, so-and-so's related to so-and-so is so inexorably tied to Star Wars it's become perhaps the defining trope of the series. That's a pretty darn bad thing for a franchise to have hanging around its neck, and it makes it just seem a little bit silly. This circles us back to the central question, when did Star Wars go bad? What property signaled and caused its decline? Now this question, as I'd said at the beginning, is by its nature a simplification. It puts a lot of blame on whatever movie we want to point to, in this case Return of the Jedi, in order to help us maintain an illusion. That being that some version of Star Wars that we'd become enchanted with, probably in our youth, was as perfect as we remember it, and that stuff that came later is pure garbage. Scapegoating a single movie is a lot easier than recognizing the inherent corniness of something we grew up liking, or maybe recognizing that a tired franchise just kind of ran its course. It also helps you maintain the scheme of a pure canon instead of recognizing that, you just like or dislike individual movies for what they are. But I still think that Return of the Jedi issued in things that degraded the quality of the series. Maybe kept us from getting something better. It set a precedent for things like recycled plots, fan service, silly cuteness, and just a general tendency toward fourth wall breaking self-awareness and cultural reference. All things that brought Star Wars to its current point of stagnation. Now, like I said before, to be fair to Return of the Jedi, a lot of this stuff might have just been inevitable. Just the result of a series becoming increasingly commercialized or falling under its own weight with time. This happens when something stays popular for too long. It's just the way things go. But if you didn't like these things in the prequels or the sequels or the streaming shows or whatever else you would point to, I think it's informative to see that a lot of this was already in Return of the Jedi. Like the Phantom Menace didn't just show up out of nowhere and slap you in the face without warning. You might have felt like it did, as I had, but I think that's just a combination of childish nostalgia and making excuses for things in the previous movies. I think we have a tendency to see all the movies as better than they were, and maybe a bit got applied to Return of the Jedi, We just maybe glossed over some of its faults. We saw that they were there, but I don't think we saw them quite for what they were, and maybe didn't recognize the downhill trajectory that they set Star Wars on. Now, there's one more thing I need to acknowledge, which is that maybe a lot of you like the story elements I'm talking about. Maybe you just think that internal references, teddy bears, Jar Jar, purple lightsabers, and all that stuff are just super great for whatever reason. So to you, maybe Return of the Jedi is benign or even a good thing. If that's the case, f*** you, you're not a real fan. Just kidding, of course. That's the opposite of what we're going for here. A lot of this conversation is subjective at its core. It's about personal experiences and personal preferences, and I think we can just all, get together and have fun talking about that, right? So if you like stuff about Star Wars that I don't, or don't like Star Wars at all, or think this is for kids, why are you talking about it? That's all perfectly fine. Everything I talked about today just came from my personal experience. Maybe some of it jived with how you see entertainment, or if not, maybe it was still interesting to hear my perspective on how we process and think about things we're fans of. Or maybe you just hated every gosh darn thing about it. Either way, I hope you enjoyed watching me share this part of my experience, and I appreciate you hanging out with me. There, now doesn't that make you feel bad for things you already typed in the comments? Have a good day, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. So today I thought I would talk about Star Wars for a little bit. More specifically, where Star Wars started to go wrong. That shouldn't cause me any kind of trouble, right? I think we can all predict nothing but smooth sailing in terms of... Oh, how did I do that?